Well, if you were ever wondering what would happen if anime fans made a Superman cartoon, here's your answer, for better or worse. My Adventures with Superman recently wrapped its first season. It's the latest Superman cartoon. There have been a few, but it has been a while since one was airing, and it's nice to see Clark again in a cartoon. There's a lot of very overt anime influences, especially when it comes to the designs of the characters, and in my opinion, it sometimes clashes. Take for example Mr. Mxyzptlk. Superman has a very clear Western influence, with his costume and primary colors, but Mixie ends up looking like he's from a totally different show, with his fantasy-style clothing and ears, and his unnatural skin tone, and putting the two side by side looks really jarring. And then there are some that look kinda like something out of How to Draw Manga, like Silver Banshee, who was another very stark contrast to her actual appearance in the DC universe, and it's giving me whiplash. Same goes for the rest of Intergang. Then there's characters like Slade Wilson. Yes, that's supposed to be Deathstroke, this blonde pretty boy, who just shows that characters don't need to be race or gender swapped to be completely unrecognizable. After finishing the season, there were parts that I really liked, but there were other parts I thought could have been improved on. One aspect that I really appreciated was how they portrayed Clark. For a while now, Superman has gotten a lot of criticism for being too good, too much of a Boy Scout, too boring, things like that, among other hot takes, including by people who have been making the content surrounding Superman. I think that's why Man of Steel ended up coming out the way it did, a darker take on Superman, and one that fans were mixed on. Snyder explained in an interview that he believes that Superman basically doesn't have any problems. He's a god on Earth and can do pretty much whatever he wants, and there's not much Earth can really do about it, which is why Lex hates him so much, and Batman apparently. Personally, I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the character. In fact, I think a lot of the hot takes about Superman just don't get his character to begin with. Another example being Todd McFarlane. He went on record saying that he thought Superman was boring because he's perfect and says everything right, and he prefers characters that are flawed, giving his own character Spawn as an example. Honestly, it kinda sounds like he's saying Superman sucks, my OC is so much better. No offense to Spawn, but he and Superman are two different characters, and that's okay. Anyway, because of this attitude of Superman being too good and too much of a Boy Scout, it became popular to create an evil version of him, like Homelander from The Boys, or Omni-Man from Invincible. Plus we got a lot of darker interpretations of Superman too, whether it was Zack Snyder's version, or Superman from Injustice. But this show decided to go back to a more traditional view of Superman, one that actually looks at the character for who he is, instead of all these stereotypes about him. He's a good guy who wants to help, but that's easier said than done, especially for someone with the strength that he has. It's like the monologue he had when fighting Darkseid in Justice League. He has to be extremely careful when going about his daily life because he feels like he lives in a world made of cardboard. He really can't just do whatever he wants. He has to take extreme care to make sure he doesn't do any harm. He's not just some strong guy with no problems. People are also extremely skeptical, believing that no one wants to just do good. There always has to be a catch. And that's another problem for Superman. He genuinely does want to do good, and that doesn't make him a bad or boring character. And I appreciate that this show chose to focus on that. That being said, I don't really like the way they handle his powers. It shows him starting to develop his powers when he's still a kid, but then as an adult he's still really struggling with interacting with the world. He's constantly breaking stuff, as if he's only just gotten his powers, but hasn't he had like 10 years or so to practice? I also wonder why he developed things like super speed and flight, but then took 10 years to develop things like super hearing. It seems like they wanted him to be that young and inexperienced character, but still an adult, so it ends up not being set up properly. This might have worked better if he was in high school instead of starting his career, but I guess that would just be Smallville. There's a very strong anime influence with this show, things like having really overt shoujo tropes, designs for things like the mechas looking basically straight out of Evangelion, or the mutants looking like Gurren Lagann. Although sometimes it felt like the people behind this show are more fans of anime than DC, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I think a lot of the anime tropes were able to land, but there were also a lot of missed opportunities that made me disappointed, like the way some of the characters and plot lines were handled. First I want to talk about Lois. This time around she's stuck as an intern, having been in that position with the Daily Planet for over a year. She's a brash go-getter, but she also has a habit of getting ahead of herself, which ends up getting her in trouble, and then Clark and Jimmy have to bail her out of it. There's a heavy focus on her and Clark's romance, and I actually think it's one of the better aspects of the show. It's very shoujo trope heavy, but it's really cute and sweet too, and I think it's one of the anime influences that worked out the best. The two share a pretty strong chemistry, and they have a genuine connection that really makes you feel for them. That being said, Lois does have a few shortcomings to her character that make her kind of frustrating. Lois ends up figuring out that Clark is Superman, which makes her resentful that he wouldn't just tell her outright, so she keeps trying to guilt him into telling her, insisting that she hates secrets and lies. But throughout the series, Lois has been lying and keeping secrets the entire time. Like in the first episode, where she tells them that Perry gave them an assignment, which is the opposite of what Perry did. She ends up putting Clark and Jimmy's career and lives on the line to do some very risky investigative journalism. They're eventually able to reconcile, but even after this point, she still keeps secrets and lies about things. It just seems like a double standard, but I do think that they managed to make it work in the end. She has a complete character arc and takes accountability for her actions, which makes her a pretty well-rounded character in the end, and it didn't end up being a repeat of Amber from Invincible, which it very dangerously could have been. And Clois is pretty cute. Jimmy is still a plucky photographer, although they don't give him much to do in the first half of the season, so he kinda ends up feeling like a third wheel. He's really into conspiracy theories, and he has a YouTube channel called Flamebird. This ends up taking off for him later in the season, but I do think there was a lot of missed opportunities here. Like, I think it would have made sense to have him be a rival to Livewire, who for some reason had a complete overhaul in this show that in my opinion does not fit her well. In this version, she's a weapons dealer with a bad haircut, no offense. Originally, she was a shock jock created specifically for the animated series back in the day. They end up taking the shock jock term literally and gave her electric powers, and she used them to become a villain for Superman, who she's been very critical of on her show. Maybe they thought the shock jock thing was outdated, but I think this could have really easily translated to her being a YouTuber or streamer for the modern day. So she could have been a Superman auntie while Jimmy was a Superman fan, and they would have naturally formed a rivalry, and it could have given Jimmy more personal stakes in the show. They did give him a hater for one episode, but this ends up becoming irrelevant later. He finds out it's Steve from The Office, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and they end up being cool by the end of the season. I did like the way they handled the reveal that he knew that Clark was Superman the entire time. That was a pretty funny scene too, although I do wonder why he was helping Lois in her search for Superman. You'd think he'd try to throw her off the scent to protect Clark, since she was going on about wanting to publish all his secrets and kept calling him a liar. I can't really blame him for not wanting to tell her that he's Superman. She was pretty harsh. You'd think with Superman in Metropolis that would be Jimmy's main focus, like making his blog all about how great Superman is, and trying to get Clark to trust him with his secret. But instead he's kind of all over the place. Like he decides to go hunt down Bigfoot, which I get it, that is a really famous cryptid, but you know, Superman's in Metropolis. Instead he ends up getting dragged off by Cadmus. I don't know if it's just that I have a specific view of Cadmus, but this was very disappointing. It's more like the sad excuse for a lab, instead of, you know, Cadmus.
How can you work for these people? Do you know what they are?
Power brokers, politicians, criminals, and black ops mercenaries with one thing in common besides. They're humanity's last hope against your kind.
Also, they used Monsieur Mala and the Brain, and of all the gorillas that could have dragged Jimmy away, it just had to be Monsieur Mala. I'm not a huge fan of the dynamic between these two. Here, Monsieur Mala was an experiment by Cadmus, and the Brain was one of the scientists that worked on him, and then they start dating. So first they experimented on this animal, and then he gets groomed into falling in love with his torturer. Yeah, that's horrifying. That's a terrible thing to happen. Oh my gosh. Of all the things to be comic accurate, this is it? Really? Also, Cadmus ends up leading into the multiverse thing. I already talked about it in a previous video, but I don't think the multiverse was handled well in this show. But I also think the plot surrounding the multiverse doesn't really work either. Lois and Jimmy are visited by a league of Lois Lanes, who seem to roam the multiverse looking for Superman to neutralize, and only Superman, not any of his usual rogue gallery, like Lex Luthor or Brainiac or anyone, since all these Loises seem to be from universes where Clark went evil, which seems strange. There's a hall showing different versions of Lois Lanes, including ones that we're familiar with, like the one from the animated universe, and Lois Prime seems to be the Lois Lane from the Fleischer cartoons, who supposedly is the founder of the League of Lois Lane. Not sure why they wouldn't use the one from the comics, but I digress. The point is, those Lois Lanes would never be hunting down Superman, and accept that even if there were versions of Superman that were evil, that doesn't mean all of them are, where these guys are pretty much hell-bent on killing any Clark they come across. Also, I feel like Lois is kind of a weird character to have a league surround, and I think other characters would make more sense, like Batman, but I guess they're working with what they have. Anyway, they end up taking Lois and Jimmy from the world that we've been following, but it turns out all they needed was a hair sample from Lois, and it seems like there are way easier ways to get it than just taking her and Jimmy along, especially when they know that they aren't going to be on board with what they're doing, so having them along would be a liability, which turns out to be the case. Couldn't they have just gone to Lois's apartment and find a hair sample on her pillow or something? Seems like that would have made more sense. Instead, they end up trapping Lois when she gets too close, and then they don't actually show how she gets out of that trap, which seems kinda cheap in my opinion. Like the writers wrote themselves into a corner and instead of actually addressing it, they just had her randomly be out of the trap. They did show that since she's another Lois Lane, she's able to control the ship somewhat, so maybe she could have used that to her advantage to escape, instead of just glossing that part over. I do wonder if they threw the multiverse into the show just because it's a trend right now, because I honestly don't think it was really that beneficial to the show itself. Most of the information we got from this episode we already knew, and anything we did learn could have easily been learned some other way. I was disappointed with how they handled Jor-El's hologram. That's such a major part of Superman, and I think they could have just used him as a way to introduce all this information and context instead of the multiverse thing. Basically, when Jor-El is revealed, Clark is really afraid of him because he's still young, so he buries him and just leaves him there for like 10 years. But then as things progress, he starts to wonder where he's from and who he is, and that information could have been given to us through Jor-El. He even takes Lois and Jimmy there to unbury the spaceship finally, and tells them that everything he does know about himself, which is admittedly not a lot, could be found here, and they could have spent the episode exploring the ship and trying to communicate with Jor-El, because right now he doesn't seem to speak English and only speaks the Kryptonian language, which I did think was a pretty cool difference than we usually get, and I'm sure Clark could have gotten a lot out of that experience, and Jimmy and Lois would have enjoyed it too, but instead we got Multiverse. And then the season finale sees Jor-El die, I guess? I mean, he's a hologram of an already dead man, but still, there goes all that storytelling potential. He was even speaking English, so I guess he was learning all this time, more than Clark was. I mean, Clark is working to be a reporter, and he keeps asking questions like, who am I? And he's sitting on a source that could answer that, but he just doesn't, which is pretty bad for a reporter. It kind of felt like Jor-El was here more for obligation than actual storytelling purposes, and they just wanted to get rid of him. Hopefully they'll fix this in season 2. We'll have to wait and see, but I really hope Jor-El's story isn't over. So there were aspects that I did like, but there were aspects I didn't care for either. I really enjoyed the final battle to save Metropolis, and Clois was pretty cute, but I also didn't care for the way some of the characters and plot lines were handled. So overall it was a mixed bag for me personally. It wasn't my favorite, but I'll check out season 2 if it comes out. So those were my thoughts. What did you guys think? Did you see My Adventures with Superman? Did you like it? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to our members: Tyrant Carnivore, Shiny Orc Boy, The Rabbit Mancer, General Bolivar, Depth Charge Media, Samaru163, Gabby Hime, Verdant Range, JVR, Hussyman42, Nixel, Phil C, Taylor Ramirez, Caleb Nelson, Dakari the Professor, Equestron, Norman Sweetcream, Way Beyond Coincidence, Garcia XV Legend, Hunter Rose, 80s Nostalgia Guy, Felix Bam, Soundboy00, Owen Wildish, Player Zero, Kitsune Fiora, Lucas Geist, Data Dine Executive, Jay Draws, Blue Spirit, Bandito Bane, Lil, Meowsers, Sky, Jin KZ, Philip, Ninja Rex, Stutania, and Isaac Martinez. Thank you all so much for your support. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to become a member, you can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this video and like our content, you can leave a like on the video and subscribe, and that part's free. We also have Buy Me Coffee if you want to support us that way. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.